origins of Bathory from Stockholm, Sweden can be traced back to 1983 with 17-year-old drummer Jonas Ackerland and his cousin, bassist Fredrik Melander. They put out an ad for a singer and guitarist, which was answered by 17-year-old Thomas Quorthon Forsberg. The trio would finally come up with the permanent name Bathory when they were allowed to record 2 tracks for the 1984 compilation album Scandinavian Metal Attack, after one of the planned bands backed out. Aggressive and unpolished, Bathory stands out from the more traditional-leaning cuts on this compilation with a chaotic blend of Motorhead and Venom, featuring raw, distorted, pre-thrash riffs and cavernous, growly vocals from Quorthon. Scandinavian Metal Attack was released on a small label called Typhon Gramophone, which was owned by Quorthon's father, Boss Forsberg. However, the fan response to Bathory was undeniable. The compilation came with an insert encouraging listeners to write back with their favorite band, and the vast majority of responses were surprisingly dedicated to Bathory, with fans eager to hear more from this mysterious, extreme band. A full-length album was immediately requested by Typhon, but Jonas and Fredrik had moved away by this point, so Quorthon would bring on bassist Rikard Bergman, who he'd played with in a punk band previously, and a drummer named Stefan Larsson to help record Bathory's self-titled debut album. Recorded on a budget of about $200 with cheap DIY equipment after only one rehearsal 2 weeks prior, the first Bathory album is maybe more interesting than good. It's an aggressive cacophony of distorted, muddy riffs, with harsh, raspy vocals, and the production ranges from not great to pretty bad. Ultimately, it all kinda blends together into an assault of chaotic lo-fi guitar and sloppy, punk-infused percussion. That said, there are some cool atmospheric elements, like the 3-minute intro of howling wind, thunder, and apocalyptic rumbling that gives the album a slight theatrical feel. And even though the music is very fast and sonically intense, there are still discernible riffs buried in there that make this more than just a complete wall of noise. It's energetic, messy, and manic, yet fairly simple and straightforward. But more than anything, it's a first stab at an idea of extreme metal that took the occult imagery, unpolished intensity, and explicitly satanic lyrics of Venom into a completely new, more serious realm.
When we started out, we were quite heavily Motorhead influenced, and you can hear that from the very earliest stuff that we did. And then listening to a certain Newcastle band a couple of years ago, what would that be, 9 years ago, we realized that yes, you can do that.
But where Venom had a fairly tongue-in-cheek delivery to their version of black metal, Bathory maintained a mysteriousness and dark sincerity that made their album feel genuinely scary. Generally mocked as unlistenable Venom clones by the mainstream, Bathory's debut album was still a hit in the underground metal scene, although the extremity of Quorthon's approach made it difficult to keep steady band members. Drummer Stefan Larsson would agree to stick around, and Quorthon would bring on new bassist Andreas Johansson to re-record Hades and War for Scandinavian Metal Attack 2, before starting work on Bathory's second album, The Return. It's less abrasive than the debut and easier to listen to overall, although it's still chaotic, with extreme, speedy riffs and satanic lyrics that are more regurgitated than sung. But it feels like The Return had a bit more thought put into it, with more consideration toward pacing and composition within the manic delivery. Of course, a lot of tracks on here, like Total Destruction, Son of the Damned, or Possessed, are pretty much straight up sonic insanity, but it all feels way more intentional. But there are also a couple of tracks on here that hint a bit more at Quorthon's burgeoning songwriting skills, like Sadist or Reap of Evil. It starts off with the expected chainsaw riffing and heavy drums, but then takes some cool turns, including a sudden dive into a heavy doom riff with a demonic spoken monologue. The Return is still very thrashy and speedy, with heavy drumming that was allegedly inspired by Canadian speed metal band Exciter, but it's also still a bit messy and not something I would revisit very often, even though it's definitely an important album in the formation of early black metal. It should also be mentioned that bassist Andreas Johansson would get kicked out about halfway through recording due to drug abuse and erratic behavior, leaving Quorthon to lay down the remaining bass tracks himself. But I'm not sure it makes too much difference, since The Return was still very much exploring the edges of mid-80s extreme metal, although with more forethought perhaps than on the rushed debut. The Return was an underground success, selling more copies than even the first album, which had also done surprisingly well. However, drummer Stefan Larsson would leave after this, and Quorthon would attempt to recruit a replacement. It's actually unclear whether a drummer named Paul Lundberg came on at this point or not, or in fact even exists. And a new bassist by the name of Christer Sandstrom was also allegedly brought on but let go fairly quickly, although he may be entirely made up as well. Either way, Quorthon would handle all or most instruments on Bathory's third album, Under the Sign of the Black Mark, released in 1987. With this album, it feels like everything Quorthon had been doing fully comes together, with a massively improved production and a huge step forward in creativity. There's still plenty of straightforward face-melting numbers like Massacre, Equimanthorn, and the album closer, Of Doom, with blistering riffs and rapid-fire growly vocals. But there is also much more composition and variety here, like on Woman of Dark Desires. This is honestly the first Bathory track that genuinely grabbed me on a first listen, with its relatively melodic chorus. And it's also the first Bathory track to utilize the synthesizer, which adds so much depth to the music, including a dreadful bed of deep bassoons and a hauntingly manic piano section. And that's followed by Call from the Grave, which opens with the sound effect of someone clawing at a coffin lid, and then goes into a slower, doomier riff that provides an entirely different side to Bathory's continued evolution of black metal.
Third album shows new side of us, where we try new things like keyboards, and I sing a little bit different, and I even do leads in every song, I think.
But the absolute highlight of this album has to be the nearly 7-minute epic Enter the Eternal Fire, which in many ways lays down the foundation of what would become Viking Metal. It's heavy, ambitious, and atmospheric, with an adventurous riff that evokes an arduous journey and a sense of haunting doom. It's not Viking Metal yet, but it introduces so many of the elements that would go on to define it. Under the Sign of the Black Mark is still manic, aggressive, and unpredictable, but in a way that feels a lot more deliberate than on previous releases, with a great mix of emotion and balls-to-the-wall headbanging. It also gets an appropriately epic album cover, which is actually not a painting, but a photograph featuring Swedish bodybuilder Leif Ernborg, wearing a loincloth and a papier-mâché goat mask. But even beyond the music and the artwork, the mystery surrounding the band was just as captivating, with many people wondering if Bathory was a full band or a one-man project.
Många säger att du är ensam, va?
Ja, visst. Mina bilder och de intervjuer som har gjorts hittills är ju de intervjuer som har gjorts med mig. En överenskommelse som vi gjorde därför att överhuvudtaget ha en kontakt med press. Så gjorde vi intervjuer och i och med att jag var den enda stadiemedlemmen från början så var det kanske det mest naturliga. Svårt att ha medlemmar som stannar i bandet tillräckligt länge under vissa perioder. Samt att när man väl har gått ut med bilder och intervjuer så tycker man kan fortsätta det hela. Sen har vi märkt efter ett tag att folk de trodde att det var en fejkad sak. Eller det här med anonymiteten och mysteriet. Och att vi märkte att folk blev lockade av det. Så naturligtvis, då spelar vi med.
The reason what, the lack of information and everything, the lack of pictures and names and everything was because from between April of 1984 to August of 1986, we had big troubles keeping the group together. Finding musicians that fit for a band like Bathory in a country like Sweden is very, very difficult. So after been going through 5 or 6 different lineups, it tends to get shallow in a certain way to answer the phone and say like, okay, you want to try out for a drummer and you've been doing that for 3 years or something. And you record the albums with the guys. And after some time you realize that they're not going to be long within the group. And there was no use to put out pictures or names or anything if you know the guy's going to leave in just a couple of weeks.
And without full-time members, touring and live shows were next to impossible. So all fans really knew about Bathory was what they saw on the albums. And so it made things even more confusing when Bathory was presented as a full band on their 4th album, Blood, Fire, Death, released in 1988. Musically, Blood, Fire, Death is the beginning of a transition away from black metal and the heavily satanic lyrics from Bathory's early albums, with several songs on here bringing in much more emotion, epicness, and power, like A Fine Day to Die, Bathory's first proper Viking Metal track, with an acoustic opening, lyrics exploring Norse mythology, and a nearly 10-minute runtime. It's a very different proposition than the 2 to 3 minute sonic attacks from the debut album.
In my lyrics, I was more or less critical to this whole religious stuff, and I realized Sweden had a very interesting mythology in itself, the Viking thing, and you had to do it in the right way so that people wouldn't believe that you were serious about it, that we do rape and pillage. It was just a story thing, like the satanic thing.
Apparently, Manowar was an influence on the mid-tempo epicness and Quorthon's growing interest in Norse mythology. This influence is further supported by the alleged band photos found within the album, featuring Quorthon and 2 other guys in loincloths, with one dude's face conveniently covered in all shots. But even if there were session players on the album, these aren't the same guys. The black metal elements are still very apparent on Blood, Fire, Death as well though, with plenty of raw aggression and blackened thrash appearing in tracks like Pace Till Death, Holocaust, and the deliriously heavy Golden Walls of Heaven. But it's impossible not to feel Quorthon moving toward a more atmospheric, theatrical focus here, with a wider range in tempos and elaborate compositions that are incredibly effective. The most elaborate example on this album is easily the title track Closer, with its whopping 10.5-minute runtime. With Blood, Fire, Death, Quorthon had further honed and developed his Viking Metal ideas. But with Bathory's following album, Hammerheart, he'd craft a fully Viking Metal masterpiece focused entirely on the power, emotion, and epicness of his new direction. Hammerheart would be an amazing album for a full band, let alone a single guy. There are so many things working together here to create a very specific kind of atmosphere. From the opening sound effects of waves crashing on the beach, to the choral chants and perfect combo of crunchy riffs and thunderous drums on the opening track, Shores in Flames. Also, Quorthon's vocals have become far less severe by this point, with a somewhat cleaner delivery that incorporates chants, wails, shouts, and battle cries that add to the warrior-like atmosphere of the album. And Quorthon's solos are usually these wild bursts of lead guitar, but are also the perfect fit for the music. There's an adventurous, bloodthirsty quality to Hammerheart that genuinely evokes the feeling of ancient Scandinavian warriors setting sail and exploring unknown foreign lands. But we also get very majestic, melodic passages on here too, like on Valhalla, that offer a sense of power and conquest. Again, there's a very Man-O-War vibe to a lot of this stuff, but it also never feels like a direct ripoff of it either. But the most epic track on an album full of epic tracks is One Road to Asa Bay, which also got Bathory's one and only music video.
One road to Asa Bay. It took 250 people, 8 horses, a lot of clothing and feeding, driving and acting, myself as well.
Did you enjoy it?
Yeah, it's a new market opening up.
and it's interesting to go in there, as interesting as making records.
It tells the story of the forced Christianization of Scandinavia, with Christian missionaries instructing the villagers to replace their pagan idols with churches, while an elder watches on, heartbroken. It's incredibly ambitious and achieves a very epic feel, even with only a $5,000 budget. Plus, possibly best of all, we get footage of Quorthon actually playing, while joined by two unknown bandmates who were likely only hired for the video.
We are trying to come up with a personal musical identity and get away from everything what people thought of us before. People tend to have these preconceived notions about you when you, for 7 years, has been playing rather speed-oriented metal, and once you change, it's not a change overnight, it's a change that has been going on for 2 years.
Quorthon would continue developing the Viking Metal identity of Bathory with Twilight of the Gods, released just over a year later. While it's along the same lines as Hammerheart, Twilight of the Gods is much more somber, with slower tempos, foreboding riffs, and a tragic atmosphere. It's more introspective and brooding, yet still very powerful and epic, featuring more grandiose, sweeping arrangements and folk elements. But even with the slower, doomish compositions, there's still some very apparent Man-O-War vibes involved, especially on the 14-minute opening title track, which feels very reminiscent of Thor the Powerhead from Sign of the Hammer. And there are also some melodic bits worked in too, like on Blood and Iron, which actually gets uncharacteristically optimistic. Overall, I like Twilight of the Gods, especially the first 3 tracks. The drums are massive, the bass feels way more present than on Hammerheart, and I love the emotional epicness of the songwriting. But I also feel like some of the vocals are a bit too strained on this one, and even off-key at times, like on the chorus of Under the Runes, for example. And the very poignant, hymn-like closing track, Hammerheart, which also feels very Man-O-War inspired, just doesn't really work for me. I know this is a big album for a lot of people, but I personally can't hold it in as high regard as Hammerheart, or even Blood, Fire, Death. It just feels a bit repetitive at times for me, and maybe a little too subdued. But I think the sense of closure was part of the point on this album, since it seems like Quorthon felt he'd taken Viking Metal as far as it could go. We have decided that we should take an enormously long break. We already have since the Twilight of the Gods album, but it's very difficult to come up with something new right now. If you've released an album like Twilight, you can't go back and write some simple speed metal tracks, you know? So we really painted ourselves into a corner, and we can't get out of that anymore. But I have a project that I'm working on right now that'll feature some music which won't fit under the Bathory umbrella, so to speak. It'll be released under the name Quorthon. So Quorthon would step away from Bathory for 3 years, focusing instead on a project simply called Quorthon. He'd release a solo album in 1994 called Album. It's honestly not that bad, mostly, but definitely a little bland, and just feels very 1994, right down to the ransom note font on the track list. The solo effort, Album, worked as a sort of therapy. I found the way back to enjoy playing again. Imagine someone asking you to go into this studio on your own to spend 2 weeks in there doing whatever the shit you feel like. If you've been tied down to something like Bathory for 10 years, every single note and word you've done in the studio having to fit under a certain umbrella, you're gonna ask yourself, just who the hell am I? Especially when a solo release is also supposed to be a personal effort, you're bloody well entitled to know, right? Love it or hate it, but that step aside, that breath of fresh air, brought me back to rock and roll. And then, on a European tour promoting his new solo album, Quorthon would be inspired by his fans to return Bathory to its extreme metal roots. I met a lot of people who were in my age group, which I probably had been corresponding with for all these years, and they had tears in their eyes when they told me how much the old albums had meant to them. You get a completely different understanding of it compared to just sitting at home with a letter in front of you. So when I returned from this 2-month promotion thing after the solo album, I thought, damn, if you could just get the energy and the inspiration back. Apparently that inspiration came pretty quickly, since Quorthon allegedly wrote the tracks for Bathory's next album, Requiem, in only 2 weeks. Requiem is a complete departure from the Viking Metal stuff Bathory had been doing on their previous 2 albums, instead going for a retro thrash death metal style with harsh vocals and a primitive lo-fi production. It is a return to the aggressive, sonically intense approach of early Bathory albums, but this time with way more of a Bay Area thrash mentality. It just doesn't do anything interesting with it though. Like, Bathory's self-titled album can be a rough listen, but it also felt like it was doing something original and pushing boundaries that hadn't really been challenged to that extent before. Requiem, on the other hand, feels rehashed, drier, and more mechanical. Ultimately, Requiem is run-of-the-mill throwback hardcore thrash, taking a sharp turn away from anything Bathory fans had been expecting. Unfortunately, things would get even worse with Bathory's 8th album, Octagon. Octagon is still very thrashy, but with some groove and industrial elements thrown in, which is all fine, but even if you like that kind of style, the production on here is absolutely awful. The guitars are kinda buried, the drums are clangy and too loud, none of the songs stood out to me, and Quorthon's barky, punkish vocals are hoarse and monotone. I've heard worse, but Octagon is abrasive and boring, which is a bad combo, and that Kiss cover at the end doesn't help things either. Between Blood, Fire, Death, and Hammerheart, Quorthon had toyed with the idea of recording a Viking-themed concept album, but it was eventually scrapped for being too ambitious, too long for a single album, and too different from the brutal satanic style Bathory was known for at the time. However, after Quorthon alluded to it in several interviews, fans began demanding that it be released. Everybody keeps pushing me to release Blood on Ice. Well, all those songs were recorded so long ago, and if they were released nowadays, people would say it just sounds like Man-O-War anyway. So after Octagon, Quorthon would finally begin restoring and completing those old recording sessions, eventually releasing Blood on Ice in 1996. And this is absolutely the most Man-O-War sounding Bathory album in my opinion, with familiar riffs and rhythms. It still doesn't come across as derivative or anything, but those references are a lot more frequent on here. But there's also way more on here than just that, including the very emotional and folky acoustic ballad, Man of Iron.
The spirits of my father's long time gone. In this short time, far from home, a man of iron I've grown.
Then we get possibly my favorite track on here, One-Eyed Old Man, which sounds like a punk version of Man-O-War.
Oh, you one-eyed old man, oh, you see it all. You see the past and all the fear. See, one-eyed old man, for I need to know. Tell me which path fate has chosen for me. Say that those come to shine on me. Say, will I set my loved ones free?
There's also a very well done monologue in this track too, from a one-eyed old man who is probably Odin, telling the main character about his future. It's in a very serious, earnest manner, which makes it even better when the main character just goes right back to the song afterward.
Victory is in your eyes. Hear me, my son, for you are the chosen one.
In a weird way, Blood on Ice feels like both a precursor to Hammerheart and an expansion on it, delving far more into a narrative through line than simply a collection of Viking-themed songs. It's definitely not a perfect album though. The production is still fairly weak on here, and some of the vocals are a little shaky, but still, the songwriting shines through and makes for a very solid album. The following year, Quorthon would return to his solo project and release a second album under the Quorthon name, Purity of Essence. I won't get too much into it, but it's a 23-track double album and nearly an hour and 40 minutes long, with a kinda wild range of styles. Essentially, it seems like anything Quorthon wanted to do that he couldn't as Bathory, including 90s alt-rock, some industrial stuff, 70s hard rock, and even some Oasis-sounding Britpop. But even after a second solo album and reworking an album he'd written a decade earlier, Quorthon would still take a few more years to put out a new Bathory album. There hasn't been a new Bathory album for quite some time, and of course there is always a reason for that. One important reason is that Bathory has covered so many sounds and styles over the years, we first of all had to take certain precautions not to duplicate anything we've done before. Yet we of course still want to maintain that specific Bathory atmosphere. When people get to hear Destroyer of Worlds at the end of this summer, we want people to be able to say, this is Bathory. And yet, we want to be able to break some new ground as far as the sound and style is concerned. Half of our fan base enjoys the brutal death metal part of our history, the other half enjoys the epic Nordic style. In order to both please as many Bathory fans as possible and satisfy ourselves as musicians, we would rather have waited some time before doing Destroyer of Worlds than instantly putting something out on the market we really wouldn't love to death 6 months later. After writing allegedly 100 tracks in a variety of styles, putting together and ultimately scrapping a concept album titled Nemesis, and shifting directions multiple times, Quorthon would finally release the 10th Bathory album, Destroyer of Worlds, in 2001. At this point, it seems that Quorthon was trying to please both sides of his perceived split fan base, leaving Destroyer of Worlds a bit directionless. And a lot of those 90s alt-rock qualities are still pretty apparent, giving the whole album kind of a weird feel. For me, the Viking Metal stuff works best, although it's also a bit more tepid on here compared to previous Bathory albums. The other half of the album is mostly thrashier, groovier stuff that I found less compelling in general, and even a bit repetitive at times. And once again, the production is quite weak, with an often thin guitar tone or ridiculously loud bass, and just an inconsistent mix throughout the album. Unfortunately, Destroyer of Worlds ends up feeling very middle of the road and unfocused, with a somewhat jarring mix of styles and an hour-plus runtime that you definitely feel. However, the following year, Quorthon would fully return to the epic Viking Metal style with the first of a two-part project, Nordland 1. Originally meant to be a single album, Nordland would get expanded into two after Quorthon wrote 20 or so tracks over a 4-month period. It leans way back into a Hammerheart or Twilight of the Gods feel, with grandiose, sweeping arrangements and atmosphere-building tracks with sound effects. There's also much more of a folk metal feel on here to me, and reminded me in parts of bands like Inciferum, for example.
Lighting up the heat, a ghostly shine. The mighty ash unites to the earthly sky for all time.
I like Nordland 1, but I do think it's the weaker of the two. Although it does contain Ring of Gold, which has to be Bathory's best acoustic folk ballad.
Dawn of time, before God sent earth and sky was first divided, started fall into river, started go into silvery water, sail by this, you shall remember, where we chose forever to keep, bind us beyond end of time to
Nordland 2, the second half of tracks from the same recording session and Bathory's last album, would come out in 2003. Nordland 2 continues the Viking Metal Nordic theme, obviously, but where the first one was maybe a little slower and more atmospheric and spiritual, Nordland 2 is packed with powerful, epic riffs and tracks that hit way harder, in my opinion. My biggest problem with both albums, aside from the almost identical cover art, is that there isn't a lot of variation within each track. Like, even in what are 10+ minute songs, it's kinda the same riff progression and melody throughout. But the stuff on Nordland 2 is so good I barely noticed, with songs like Seawolf, Vinland, The Messenger, and of course, The Wheel of Sun, a 12-minute cut that is the epitome of epic. The vocals can still get a bit sketchy and the drums sound painfully synthetic, but even so, this is a fantastic piece of epic Viking metal and a worthy addition to the Bathory discography. Sadly, in June of 2004, Thomas Quorthon Forsberg passed away due to heart failure at the age of 38, leaving behind a legacy that continues to influence metal bands today, which brings me to your homework for Bathory. Bathory from 1984 and The Return from 1985 are historic touchstones of early black metal, but Under the Sign of the Black Mark from 1987 is where things get really good. Blood, Fire, Death from 1988 and of course Hammerheart from 1990 are absolute must-listens as well. And Twilight of the Gods from 1991, which isn't quite as compelling as the two before it for me, but still a solid, enjoyable album. From there, I'd go directly to Blood on Ice from 1996, and then the Nordland albums from 2002 and 2003. Both are very good, but Nordland 2 is a superior album for me, and an amazing closer for a far too short career. Especially in the 80s, it was practically unheard of for a metal band to have a singular experimental vision in the way that Bathory did. And Quorthon found himself in the beneficial position of not only having access to a studio and a professional producer, but also having an outlet for his music that allowed him to experiment in a way that very few other metal musicians could at the time. I hope you enjoyed this look back at Bathory and Quorthon, a unique and crucial figure in heavy metal in the formation of black metal and folk metal. As always, thanks for watching and see you next time.